Welcome back to one of the final weeks that we have here in EDCI 200. And this week we're going to talk about assessment. We're going to talk about how do we know our students have learned. We're going to talk about assessment, types of assessment, forms of assessment, assessment tools, the uses of assessment in the classroom, purposes of assessment. Okay. Number one is, what is it? Assessment is measurement. Write that down. Assessment is measurement. Okay. Now, there is some evaluation that goes along with assessment, but that's part of the assessment cycle. An assessment itself is nothing more than measuring something. Okay. So, for instance, it would be as if I measured this desk with the intent of wanting to fit it at a certain spot in my office. Well, if I know there's a certain spot in my office that I want to put this desk, I need to make sure it's going to fit. Okay. Now I measure it and I find that I've got an inch on either side, so it'll be perfect. It fits nicely. But what happens if it's too big? Well, I have some options, right? I could shave off the end of the desk, maybe. I could rearrange where it's going to make room for it. Or I could find a new desk. Those decisions are part of the assessment cycle. Okay. That's what we call evaluation. That would be the moment where a lot of times people mix up testing and assessment. Okay. Test is nothing more than an assessment tool. It allows you to gather information. What we do with that information is called evaluation. So we're adding a value to it, trying to figure out, all right, how do we value each portion of this assessment? The assessment itself is measurement. And when we use it, we're trying to find out where you are on a continuum. So when I design assessments for the classroom, I'm looking at it to see where you're at in terms of being prepared to go out and teach in the public school classroom. Now, rules dictate that I have to put that into an ABCDF format. For me, I've worked that out over time to be able to disperse those fairly. What I don't always agree with is having to do that because everybody moves at their own pace. But I know that once you complete this process, you are going to be fine teachers. So part of this is knowing what to look for. And in music, it's so difficult, right? Because it's latent variables. Latent variables are those variables that are secondary behaviors. Okay. So how do we know that something's musical? Okay. Well, we need to think about, well, what is the person doing that is making it musical? Dynamics, tone, shaping, phrasing. Okay. We can measure those because we can hear those and we can react. Well, then we say, okay, well, that's the musical side. What are they doing physically to make that happen? How are they breathing? What is their technique like? What's their posture like? What's their rhythm like? How do we know it's a steady pulse? How do we know how they're using rubato? Those are what we have to define in assessment. And that's what makes music both exciting and a little overwhelming when we start thinking about measurement. So what is it? Is it grades, achievement, scores, tests? It's a little bit of everything, right? But it goes back to its measurement. Yeah, you have to give scores. Yes, you have to give grades. And yes, there are going to be tests. And we're going to expect certain achievement from our students. But the assessment itself is to guide our instruction, to help us adjust our own teaching, and above all, to provide the most meaningful feedback for our students. Assessment is a feedback tool for your students. Okay, so there's a 3-step process. Number one, we're going to collect data to measure student performance. We're going to evaluate those data, and then we're going to take actions based on that data, okay? Whether that be redoing the lesson, whether that be adjusting the lesson for next time, whether that be bringing in new content, or it could be something as simple as we're going to just try it again because maybe the fire alarm went off that day. All right. So we have to take in all the data and then we make decisions on our instruction, teaching, and student learning based on our experiences. And that is the assessment process. Assessment is not just the test. Assessment is an ongoing process that is a cycle and it's a spiral and it continues on through this entire time that your students are in your classroom. So why assessment? The best reason we can put in for assessment is how are you going to know that your students have met your expectations? And also, it is a great reflection on the design of your classroom, what you're teaching, how you're teaching. And so it helps you as it become a better teacher, but also it helps you to know whether the students are learning based on that instruction that you're giving them. So assessment is very important. The assessment process is critical to being an effective teacher and being a productive teacher. So some of the purposes. Number one, first and foremost, improving student learning. That is the primary purpose. Second is improving your teaching. The third, improving your programs. So you're going to have a level of program assessment that allows you to know, is your program doing what you're intending it to do? And then number four, informing the stakeholders, the students, the parents, the Board of Administration or Board of Education, local companies that support your program. Assessment, you can bottle it and you can package it and you can send it out to those stakeholders and say, this is what we're doing. Your donations to this program, here's how it's impacting student learning. Here's how it's impacting teaching in the classroom. Here's how it's improving the program. Here's how it's connecting with the community. Here's what we add. Here is our value. This is what we do. That is one of the purposes of assessment. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to hit pause in just a moment. And I want you to write down in your own words, when you think of a teaching cycle, when you think of a lesson or a rehearsal, what does that cycle look like? Okay, and take 45 seconds, a minute, and just kind of draw it out as a circle and what with arrows and what has to happen. What is that process? What does it look like? Hit pause now. All right, welcome back. So now let's take a look, and I want you to have your cycle written down, and I want you to compare it to what we're about to go through. Okay, the first thing that we have in the teaching cycle is a set. Okay, so this is going to be a directive given from the teacher. So this could be everybody sit down. This could be, all right, everybody instruments up. Or this could be everybody focus on measure 24. Something along those lines, a directive given by the instructional leader. Okay, the next is the follow through. Okay, so now this would be, if I had said, all right, we're playing measures 24 to 39. Follow through would be 3 and boom. And then we rehearse it. All right. Now, this is what the learner does in response to the directive. So this is the students performing. It could be a line out of the method book. It could be a set of measures from a piece that you're working on. It could be a warm-up, okay? But the follow-through is what the learner does in response to the directive. Now we're getting to the assessment. Now, in the classroom, this is primarily informal assessment that goes on, especially during a rehearsal, because we're listening and then we're providing feedback in real time on what we're listening to. Okay, so the measurement, observe what the learner demonstrates. So for us, as a conductor, that's where we are listening. And then we're providing feedback, whether that be through questioning, and we'll talk more about that in your later years here at K-State, or through direct feedback, okay? But the measurement is when we observe what the learner demonstrates, and then we evaluate it. And what we mean by evaluation is, did they meet our criteria? So remember, this is why it's important to write that objective, is because you're constantly comparing against that criteria that you set up. And if they met the criteria, great. If not, and we'll talk more about what happens if they meet it or if they don't. But we're constantly evaluating where they are versus what those criteria are. Okay, so compare your observation with the intent of the directive. This is what we call informal assessment. Now, this is happening in real time. So think about this in the lens of a rehearsal. This is you as the conductor listening to what's happening and listening to how they're performing. And in the set, you have told them what you want to focus on. You perform that section that you want them to focus on and then you're listening and observing, and you're trying to evaluate it against what your expectations are. All right, so now we come to the decision-making process after the evaluation. Okay, so we have to come up with a response. So we've cut off. Now we can affirm, and we can say, yes, that's exactly it. Let's do that again and make sure we solidify it. But yes, that is what I want. Okay, so they've met all of your criteria. Okay, what you observed matched the intent of the set. And this is the important part. You have to make them aware. You have to let them know, yes, you are doing the right thing. That's exactly what we wanted. Okay, now there's another option. We could do a modified set. Okay, a modified set suggests that the directive wasn't met and some adjustment to instruction needs to take place, which means I give you the directive, it wasn't quite what we needed, so now I have to go back and I have to think, okay, where do I adjust my instruction a little bit? Do we need to go back and work on a couple of fundamentals first before we go to that follow through again? Do I need to remind you of a certain concept? But we have to put that together in some way, shape, or form. So we're going to modify the set. Okay, that's one option if the set is not met. Okay, and then we modify the set and we go back to the follow through and we try it again. We measure it. Sometimes we just need a reset. Okay, sometimes the bell goes off right during the action, or the intercom comes on and they say, please send Johnny to the front office. Or in one case, I was watching a student teacher one semester and the fire alarm goes off. Well, lo and behold, the Family and Consumer Sciences kitchen were doing steaks that day and they set the building on fire. And so right in the middle of his observation, he's super nervous. I'm in there watching him teach, and the fire alarm goes off. His cooperating teacher had gone to KMEA already, and so we're in there with a substitute teacher, the student teacher, and then me as a guest. And then it's cold outside, and nobody brought their jackets to the band room. And so we all have to go outside. They can't go get their jackets because the building's on fire. You can imagine that their playing wasn't exactly the best during that run through. So we would have to say, all right, let's just reset it. Let's try it again. Now, luckily it was in the other end of the building. And so we were able to go back into the room and start it over again. And they did get to finish rehearsal. Luckily it was block scheduling, so we had enough time to make that happen. The nice thing was, is we were able to reset and they were able to get it done. Okay, so a reset, all that means is that the evaluation suggests that the directive wasn't met, but can be with one more attempt. Okay, no additional instruction is needed. Whereas with the modified set, it wasn't met, and we need a little bit of additional instruction, and then we're going to follow through again. And then there's this alternative. It's a release. Okay, and what the release says is that the directive wasn't met and won't even be met even if I add additional instruction. Okay, now there we again have to make the learner aware. We're not ready for this. And here's what you need to do to improve. Here are the areas where we can improve as an ensemble. Here are the things that you can do at home where you can practice and improve and help us meet this goal. Okay, so the directive is kind of like your lesson objective, right? And so you have to make them aware. Now, keep in mind, one of the things that often gets lost in translation is that we don't communicate this teaching cycle well with our students because we don't always say, use this same process when you practice. And we don't teach this process to them. But when you sit down and you think about how you practice in the classroom or in your practice room, you kind of go through this process all the time. But we have to teach this. Maybe you don't. And maybe you're sitting here going, oh, I've been practicing wrong the whole time. Or you might be going, yes, that's why it works when I do this. Okay? Is taking these teaching cycles, but teaching them how to use them to their advantage. And understanding that this is what we're going through. Okay? Now, with the teaching cycle, typically what you want is you want this to go in an arc. All right? And the attention span of most of our students will be anywhere from 12 to 15 minutes. Okay? So you've got to ramp it up for about 3 or 4 minutes. Okay? Which means you're going to have about 7 to 8 minutes of really honed in students. And then they're going to come in on the back end of the curve, those last 3 minutes. Okay? So we know that we've got about 8 minutes of intensive learning, and then we need to start closing it up and either transition into another warm up and then go into another cycle. So knowing about 15 minutes, you might be able to shorten it to, let's say, a 12-minute cycle. And within a 45 minutes, or let's say an hour-long class, you're only going to get 4 cycles. Okay? You might get 5 if you really tighten it up. Which means when you put together a rehearsal plan, in this teaching cycle, we've got 5 teaching cycles, which means I can hit 5 spots. And I can hit 5 spots really, really smoothly. Now, if I have a 2-hour rehearsal, then I'm going to have to, with block scheduling, you might have them for 90 minutes. Now you've got to think about not only attention span, but fatigue. So this teaching cycle, if we know that they're about 10 minutes in length, now that helps us plan. We know how many plans to go through, how many cycles we have to be able to hit these specific objectives. And then the cycle continues until their response, you either affirm or release. Major issue is incomplete cycles that lack response. So this is the most critical part. This is what we call closing the loop in the assessment world. Okay, so when we're assessing, if we don't provide the response and the direct feedback and the specific feedback to the students, by not completing the cycle, then it ends up open-ended for the students and the learning suffers. So that's just something to keep in mind. All right, so this is going to get now to what we're going to work on next week, and that's looking at lessons, okay? Determine your objectives, all right? And then once you've determined your objectives, think about what the assessment's going to be. And then what materials are you going to need? What will the students need to be successful? What is that sequence? Okay, we've talked about all of these so far: objectives, assessment, sequence. And then you design a transition, because remember, you're going to be hitting more than one concept in a lesson. So you've got to have a transition from one to the next, from one teaching cycle to the next. And then when you're done, you close the lesson. You let them know what they're talking about next week, and then you move on from there. This essentially is our closure. We're talking about, okay, we've talked about assessments, okay, and the role of assessment and the teaching cycle. And now we're leading into lessons. And what that looks like, so the task is, using your objective and sequence from the previous weeks, develop an assessment, okay, and sketch out a possible lesson plan to teach your stated objective. Now, when I say develop an assessment, what I want you to do is I want you to either create a short, you can do a multiple choice test if you want, that's fine. You could develop a rubric, okay? And I'm going to send you to, I've got some resources on Canvas that are going to take you on how to design a rubric. It will help you with that process. But I want you to just experiment with that, okay? And I want you thinking about, in one of the discussion boards, I'm going to have you write a rubric for a performing task in your classroom, okay? So using your objective in the sequence from the previous week, develop an assessment and start sketching out a lesson plan that you plan to teach to meet your stated objective, okay? And I'm going to provide a template. As you can see, objective, and then the materials for instruction, the lesson sequence, the assessment, and then any transition material. You may or may not have that at this point, which is fine. And then a closure for sure. I want you thinking about what those next steps are and how you're going to let your students know. But this is your general outline of what a lesson plan looks like. So ultimately, oh, sorry. Now, ultimately, what I would like to do is we're going to go in and we're going to write a new lesson plan from point A to point B. And we'll talk about that at our next meeting. Great work. And be sure to check out the resources that we have on Canvas. One of them is going to be a rubric maker. The other is going to be talking a little bit about other assessments. Be sure you read through those, read through all of that. And then I've got some discussion boards and some other small assignments on building assessments that I want you to go through. Once you've done that, we will meet next week and start talking about developing your final lesson plan. Great work, and look forward to seeing you all at our next meeting.